The sun beat down on the sleepy suburban neighborhood of Fairview, Pennsylvania. Officer Wendy Riley cruised down the quiet streets, her patrol car kicking up dust as she went. She'd been on the force for 5 years now, and Fairview up along Lake Erie was home to her. But most days, her biggest concern was catching teenagers speeding on their way home from school. But today, there was a different kind of tension in the air. As Wendy pulled up to the park, she saw a group of teenagers huddled together, their faces pale and drawn. They were the same kids she'd seen just yesterday, laughing and playing basketball. Now, they looked like they'd seen a ghost. Wendy got out of her car and approached the teenagers. "What's wrong, kids?" she asked gently. The teenagers looked at each other hesitantly. Finally, a skinny boy with a mop of red hair stepped forward. We saw a monster," he stammered. Wendy raised an eyebrow. Teenagers and monsters were pretty standard fare for a Friday night, but something about these kids' demeanor made her take them seriously. "Can you tell me what happened?" she asked. The teenagers all spoke at once, a jumble of words about a giant reptilian creature and glowing eyes. Wendy listened patiently, trying to piece together their story. According to the teenagers, they had been hanging out in the woods behind the park when they heard a loud crashing sound. When they went to investigate, they saw a massive creature unlike anything they'd ever seen before. It was reptilian, with leathery skin and glowing red eyes. The creature let out a blood-curdling roar and chased them back to the park. Wendy thanked the teenagers for their report and promised to look into it. These were good kids, not known for trouble, but could their story really be true? Wendy decided to check out the woods where the teenagers had seen the creature. She entered the woods, her hand hovering over her taser. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and decaying leaves. As Wendy ventured deeper into the woods, she heard a loud sound behind her. She whirled around, her heart pounding in her chest, but there was nothing there. Wendy continued on, her nerves on edge. She was starting to think the teenagers had been playing a prank on her. But then, she saw it. There, in a clearing ahead, were giant footprints unlike anything she'd ever seen. They were at least twice the size of any human footprint, and the toes were long and curved. Could this be proof of the creature the teenagers had seen? Suddenly the ground trembled, and a loud roar echoed through the trees. There, in the distance, she saw a massive reptilian creature emerge. It was just like the teenagers had described, with leathery skin and glowing red eyes. This was no monster. This was something else entirely, something she couldn't even begin to understand. The creature lumbered towards Wendy, its every step shaking the ground. Wendy knew she had to get out of there. She turned and ran, her legs pumping like pistons. She didn't dare look back. Wendy burst out of the woods and into the park, collapsing onto a bench. She took a deep breath, trying to calm her racing heart. What she had just seen was unbelievable, but it was real. She radioed for backup and reported what she had seen. The dispatcher on the other end of the line didn't believe her at first, but when Wendy insisted, the dispatcher sent another patrol car to check out the woods. When the backup arrived, Wendy led them back to the clearing where she had seen the creature, but the creature was gone, and the only sign that it had ever been there were the giant footprints which she was thankful for, glad they helped in not making her look crazy. Over the next few days, Wendy interviewed the teenagers who had seen the creature. She also spoke to some of the other residents of Fairview, but none of them had seen anything unusual. Wendy started to think she was losing her mind. Then, she made a discovery. While searching through the woods trying to piece it all together, she stumbled upon a hidden cave entrance, partially obscured by overgrown vines, and against her better judgment, she decided to investigate. The air inside the cave was stale and dusty, with an unsettling stillness. Wendy pulled out her flashlight and cautiously stepped inside. The cave floor was uneven, littered with loose rocks and pebbles. As she ventured deeper, the passage narrowed, forcing her to stoop low. Suddenly, the beam from her flashlight fell upon a series of strange markings etched into the cave wall. They were intricate spirals and geometric shapes that seemed to shimmer with an otherworldly light. These weren't random markings. They were deliberate. Just then, a low growl echoed from deeper within the cave. Wendy's heart pounded in her chest. The sound matched what she had heard the first time. She gripped her taser tighter, fear gripping her like a vice. She needed to know what was down there. As she rounded a bend in the passage, the cave opened into a vast cavern. The sight that greeted her took her breath away. Nestled in the center of the cavern was a huge mound, its surface pulsating with a faint rhythm. Wendy couldn't tear her eyes away. This mound somehow felt connected to the creature she'd seen. Before she could ponder it further, another chilling growl ripped through the air. This time, it was closer. Wendy spun around, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. There, at the far end of the cavern, stood the creature from before. Its eyes locked onto Wendy. Panic surged through her. She knew she couldn't fight this thing. She turned and ran, her boots wobbly on the uneven cave floor. The creature gave chase, its heavy footsteps echoing behind her. Wendy pushed herself further, her lungs burning. Finally, she reached the cave entrance. Scrambling out, she turned back for a fleeting moment. The creature stood at the mouth of the cave, its silhouette framed against the night sky. Wendy collapsed onto the ground outside the cave, gasping for breath. Her body trembled. She had to get back to town and get away from this thing. Wendy stumbled to her feet. She raced back to her patrol car. The drive back to Fairview was a blur, but she knew that her report would be met with disbelief. But she had to try. The captain, a gruff man named Harris, listened to her story with a raised eyebrow. When she finished, the room was silent. "Officer Riley," he finally said, his voice low, "I appreciate you bringing this to my attention, but frankly, I'm unsure of the validity of something like that living here. Either way, I am determined to look into this for you." As Wendy watched, a bead of sweat trickled down Captain Harris's temple. Maybe, just maybe, she wasn't crazy after all. Maybe the town of Fairview was about to become the center of something much bigger, and Wendy Riley was about to find herself on the front lines of a battle she never knew existed. But the truth is that the captain never followed up with her, and the few times she asked about it, he just said that the case is still pending and never gave her any information. She is trying to forget about it, but feels she is being duped into thinking something is being done, when it really isn't. So she has written into us to see if we can help her and offer any information. Hopefully we can help her bring closure to this. Hi, I've been a fan of your channel for a long time now. I love listening to the insightful stories you tell while I get ready for work in the morning. I love your show and anything having to do with the paranormal and unexplained mysteries of the world. I constantly watch ghost shows and stories where people encounter strange creatures. I'm kind of obsessed with the subject. So now I want to tell you about a time I experienced something that I can only describe as paranormal. It is the only paranormal experience I've ever had, and while I'm fascinated by the subject, to experience it firsthand is seriously intense. I'm now hoping it's the only one I ever experience, but I like to think I helped this woman out. Back in college, I was driving home to visit my parents for winter break. It was about a 9-hour drive, but one I'd made a couple of times already, so I was familiar with the road. I was jamming out to some music when I noticed the traffic started getting worse and worse. It was frustrating, but it's part of life when you travel this time of year. Then I could see up ahead that the traffic was just completely stopped. I was about to call my parents and let them know I would be late when traffic started picking up again. Unfortunately, I discovered that the reason for the heavy traffic was a horrific car accident. It was a bad scene. Suddenly, I felt a weird presence. I looked in the side mirrors and then the rear view mirror. It was then that I saw the figure of woman in work clothes sitting in my back seat. I was in shock, and I just kept looking back and forth at the road and back to the mirror so I wouldn't crash. She kept looking around my car and patting her chest and thighs. Finally, she looked at me and said, "Where am I?" I didn't know what to say. My car doors were locked, and my car was in motion the whole time, so it was impossible for her to be there. I wondered if I was going crazy and imagining this woman. Then she grabbed my arm and asked me who I was. I looked at her and I told her my name, and she asked where I was taking her. I took a deep breath and told her that I thought she might have been in a car accident. She didn't say anything for a while. She just kept patting herself and looking around my car. She asked me again where I was taking her, this time a little more panicked. I explained to her that I passed by a terrible car accident, and that's when she appeared. She didn't say anything for a while, and I just kept driving down the road. Finally, I said to her, "Look, I don't know how else to say this, but I think you're dead. You're not really here in this world." She started crying, and she kept saying it was impossible. I didn't know what to say. I agreed with her that it was impossible. But there we were, talking to each other. Now, I've watched enough shows on the paranormal to know that you want your soul to pass on to the other side instead of being stuck here for all eternity. I spit out the words as bluntly as I could. "Ma'am, you are dead. You need to go to heaven. You don't want to stay here in purgatory. Go to the light." I didn't know what to say. I pointed at the moon and said, "Do you see any lights that are brighter than that moon?" She looked around and said no. A couple of moments passed, and she looked straight up, and in a nice, calm voice she said, "Oh." Then she disappeared, and I felt relieved. I kept driving down the road and telling myself that I had imagined it, but it was far too real. I told my parents what had happened, and they were curious about how she actually went into the afterlife. I had no idea, but I imagine when she said, "Oh," she must have seen something like a portal into the spirit world or to heaven. The whole thing was crazy, so I turned on the TV to unwind from the drive, and on the news was a picture of the same woman that was in my car. I yelled to my parents, "That's her, that's the woman." I then listened as the reporter explained that she was killed in that accident along the same highway I had been traveling. I couldn't believe it. I was freaking out. I often wonder why the woman ended up in my car out of the hundreds of others she could have gone to. It is so fascinating. I'd love to be able to get her input about what she saw once she got to the other side. I kept hoping that she would visit me in a dream, but that never happened. I even went to a psychic medium once and asked about that woman. Apparently, I have an ancestor who acts like my guardian angel, but the medium couldn't get any reading on that woman's spirit. I hope that means that she really did pass on completely into the afterlife, and I hope that she's living the rest of eternity in peace. In hindsight, I wish I had gotten her name and tried to contact her family. I'm sure her family would love to know that she visited me and she passed on peacefully to the other side. Maybe one day I'll set some time aside to do that. But for now, I'll just say, thanks for listening to my story, and thank you for putting out so many awesome videos. I'm looking forward to watching the next one, and I've turned everyone at work onto your channel. Every Thanksgiving, I take my family down to New Jersey to visit my parents. They're getting older, and I want my 2 boys to spend as much time as possible with them before the inevitable happens. They live on an immense piece of property not too far from the Wharton State Forest. They aren't overly wealthy or anything. The land has been in my family's hands for over 100 years. My grandfather used to operate a farm on it, but those days are long gone. We were going to stay a total of 5 days. It was just me, my wife, 2 sons, and my parents, so it was a quiet Thanksgiving. At first, anyway. My parents went to bed super early, so we had more of a Thanksgiving lunch, and then just relaxed in the afternoon, spending time outside and working off the food. Then, Around 3 p.m., my wife and I were finishing up the cleaning while my parents rested in the living room. Our oldest asked if he could take his 3-year-old brother outside to play for a little bit, and we both told him that would be fine. About 100 yards away from the back of the house is a small pond, maybe 20 feet wide. It wasn't more than a foot deep, and there were no fish in it. But deer and other critters would often come from the nearby woods to grab a drink from it. We told my son to stay away from it, more so that the kids didn't accidentally get wet rather than from any danger of drowning. But letting them go outside turned out to be a big mistake. About 20 minutes had passed, and I was at the sink wiping down the last bowl when I looked out to check on the kids. The view from the window encompassed a good portion of the back of the property, including the little pond. The sun was almost down, but I could just make out a large shape, head bent down, over by the pond. I dropped my bowl in the sink and quickly rushed out the back door. Deer are common in the area, and if this thing was as big as I thought it was, then it was probably a buck. They were usually harmless, but I'd seen plenty of YouTube videos of them attacking people and wanted to get my kids back inside. But they were nowhere in sight. The view from the back door isn't as good as the window. My mother kept a substantial garden and had some high rose bushes that she was proud of. I walked quickly around them and with a quiet sigh of relief caught sight of my 2 boys. Only something was definitely wrong. I could see them, about 100 feet away, hunkered down behind the stump of a large tree my father had removed a few years ago. It seemed like my oldest son had his hand clamped around the younger one's mouth, who was starting to squirm and fidget. I started towards them and came around the rose bushes, which gave me a view of the pond. I got a better look at the thing that was drinking from the pond and felt a flood of panic when I realized that it wasn't a deer at all. The thing was the size of a big horse, at least 7 feet high. It was hard to tell exactly, but I could almost swear it had a set of wings tucked in against the sides of its body. I felt a sense of unexplainable dread wash over me. Something in my mind was screaming for me to get away from it, but there was no way I would ever have left my kids. Almost immediately, another fear, the fear of being seen by this thing, came over me, and I dropped to the ground. I crawled army style the rest of the way to where the kids were, and after getting about halfway, they spotted me. I gave my oldest the signal to stay put, and even the younger one calmed a bit when he saw me. I couldn't see the creature from my vantage point, but I knew for certain that it was still there. Eventually, I got to them. I popped my head over the stump and confirmed the creature was still there, though something appeared to have drawn its attention away from us. It was now looking at the tree line at the back of the property. We had a problem. I couldn't crawl with my youngest son and wouldn't dare let him out of my grasp once I had him. The older one would be fine, but I didn't want to separate. We were going to have to run for it. Saying this now is easy, but in the moment, the idea of this thing seeing us was horrifying, and I was almost paralyzed by my terror. But as a parent, keeping my children safe overrode anything else I may have felt. I hashed out the path we would take, and after a few deep breaths we took off, me carrying the youngest. We had gone about halfway, and I thought we were going to get away unseen when I heard it. It sounded like a bleating mixed with a screaming person. It was piercing, and I stumbled when I heard it. My oldest, a few feet ahead, stopped mid-run and covered his ears. I shifted my youngest to one arm and grabbed my oldest's hand as I passed him. We could see the back door ahead of us, and the sound must have drawn my wife's attention. She opened the door, wide-eyed as she caught sight of us running towards her. I shouted for her to get back inside, and my voice seemed to aggravate the thing. I could hear a slight gust of wind, like something taking off, and the bleating rose into the air behind us. But closer. We dashed the last few yards to the back door and dove inside the house, landing in a pile. My wife slammed the door closed, and we all sat in complete silence. The noise continued for another few moments, coming from all around the house like the sound of a helicopter circling, until it eventually faded away and then was gone altogether. We were a little banged up from falling into the house, but otherwise okay. My parents had snoozed through the entire scenario, and when I asked them what it was, they looked confused and said they have not idea. We stayed another day and ended up cutting our trip a day short. Part of me felt terrible about leaving my parents there with that thing in the area, but on the other hand, they had lived there for 70 years without incident. Of course, I have heard stories of monsters like the Jersey Devil, and the thing we saw matched the description. But there's no way that it's actually real and that we encountered it. Is there? I am writing this journal entry in response to the strange events of the last couple of nights. I am not sure what I have seen these past few nights, but they are extraordinary nonetheless. 3 weeks ago, I decided to make a solo backpacking trip into the heart of the wilderness in upstate New York. I stayed away from the trails because I wanted to get more in touch with nature. It was supposed to be a healing journey, which my therapist said I should do. Boy, I bet they won't believe what I will tell them in our next session. They will probably give me a one-way ticket to the mental health ward. However, I know what I saw, and it wasn't of this earth. I planned to backpack into the wilderness of the High Peaks region. I waited until after the close of deer season to avoid any hunters that may mistake me for a deer. After all, it has been known to happen. Since the season ends around the second week of December, I knew I needed to be prepared for the cold winter and snow. I would bring along a sled to help bring in all my supplies, such as a hot tent, stove, and other supplies. I parked at a public parking lot with a note indicating where I would be in case of an emergency. From there, I made the arduous journey into the heart of the wilderness. Progress was slowed by downed trees that seemed to grab at my sled at every turn. However, I strove onward. I stopped a couple of hours before nightfall to set up camp and cut some firewood for the night. I knew I wanted to get further in so I could relax. The first night was relatively uneventful. I made a cup of hot chocolate while I stared at the clear sky. The beautiful aspect of the wilderness is you don't have to deal with light pollution. You get to see all of the stars in their glory. Now and then, you see planes in the sky, but for the most part, the night sky is unmolested by man. At one point, I saw a blip of a light zoom quickly across the sky. I figured it was a satellite or some comet. Eventually, the cold night forced me into the warm tent, and from there, I drifted off to sleep. The next day, I moved deeper into the wilderness. An uneventful day as I slowly made my way deeper into the woods. Once I found a suitable location to camp at for the next few days, I quickly went to work getting everything ready. Within 2 hours, I had enough wood to last a few days. Then I began to relax as the sun started to set finally. Again, I enjoyed a cup of hot chocolate as I enjoyed the view of the night sky. After about a half hour, something seemed weird. I noticed a light that I assumed was a jet or plane. It seemed normal at first, but then it changed direction every few seconds. Then it came to a complete stop in midair before going in reverse. This was incredibly odd because I knew that this was no ordinary plane. Maybe it was some sort of new prototype tested by the Air Force. Either way, I felt uncomfortable for some reason. This lasted for about 10 minutes. Afterward, I went to bed, which was the end of that night. The third day was freezing, so I stayed in camp most of the day. I read a little bit here and there. Mostly I kept the fire going in the stove and napped. I ate a late dinner and decided to call it an early night. Around midnight, I was awoken by a blinding light. I was so disoriented that I didn't know what to think. At first, I thought someone was shining a spotlight on my tent. Then I realized that the light was coming from above rather than from the ground. Then my mind began to race. My only explanation was a helicopter must have spotted me and decided to use me as a practice dummy. When I unzipped the tent to look outside, the light was instantly gone and it was completely quiet. It should have been the sound of a helicopter at least flying away, but there wasn't anything. I became scared and immediately grabbed my hatchet. I couldn't sleep at all the rest of the night. There was something odd about the light as well. It seemed to pulse with different hues of light now that I reflect on what happened. It almost seemed alive, but that didn't make any sense. I decided that I would start heading out at the first light. I knew I had another night of camping before I could make it out of here, but I wanted to put some distance between me and whatever I dealt with last night. I skipped lunch to get more miles in before I had to set up camp, and I hiked a good distance. I felt more at ease for the night, knowing I had put a large distance in. I enjoyed my dinner before I headed to bed. I wanted to get up early to get out of the wilderness by noon. Around midnight, it happened again. I was awoken again by a blinding light, but it seemed more intense this time, as if it was closer. I heard a metallic hum that grew louder as the light beam intensified. I was so scared by what was happening, I didn't even worry about my boots as I quickly unzipped the tent. What I saw next left me dumbfounded. Maybe 100 feet above me was a circular object that emitted light in its center. Other lights emitted from the sides danced across the surrounding area and constantly changed colors. The light in the center went out seconds after I was outside the tent. There appeared to be a glass window from which I could see the silhouette of two people, except I don't know if they were people. They were tall and skinny, but there was something about the shape of their heads. They looked long and cylindrical. I knew that image would stay with me forever. The whole thing only lasted about 2 minutes. Once I saw the pilots, the object they were in began to ascend quickly. Within a few seconds, it had disappeared into the night sky. I quickly packed up camp and followed my previous trail out of the woods in the dark. I arrived in the parking lot, exhausted and freaked out still. I didn't waste time getting home, speeding most of the way. I'm afraid this isn't the last I will see of that aircraft, which scares me the most.